Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is the second chapter of the abnormal psychology, and this chapter is really interesting. This is basically going to get into more detail on the perspectives that we kind of touched on in the first chapter of how do mental disorders begin, and how do they maintain, as well as how do they potentially get treated, as you can see right here. One thing that I was thinking about, I just think like, what's this guy thinking? I love the cover. Covers of textbooks are interesting. So this guy, like, what does he do? Is he looking depressed? He's looking down. He does look kind of depressed. Maybe he's anxious. Something's wrong. Maybe I always think that maybe he's looking like actually he's looking down at something. Maybe he's looking at like a penny down there or something, or I don't know, maybe like to me it almost looks like he's doing the moonwalk. If you see it in reverse, he's not walking forwards, he's actually walking backwards. Who knows, what these textbook authors do, but I guess we get the point. He's looking depressed somehow, but you never know. Alright, so let's get on with the actual material. So, guys, first of all I gotta say that there's a lot of slides here, so I'm going to probably be skipping quite a few of them, but I'll leave them up here just so you guys can, pause it and view whichever ones you want to. Again, we've already talked about the biological perspective. Has some nice, roots from Hippocrates, from ancient Greece, and this is basically looking at the genes, neurotransmitter levels, and neural activity within the brain. Okay, so to get into the biological perspective, you have to actually start looking at the things that compose the brain, and so we roughly have roughly under 100 billion. Recent research suggests that there's about 80 billion of these little guys. And those little guys I'm talking about are neurons. And so you probably remember neurons from your intro to psychology, and that's not a neuron, but that's how you spell it. A neuron is a small cell that is within the brain. And so these are the essential system that is going to be relaying messages throughout the brain. And so so in a neuron there's a lot of parts, and this is all very review, but you have the beginning of a neuron, that's the dendrites. You have the axon here. This is the axon, as you can remember, is the structure that takes information from the dendrites. The soma, that's the cell body, and takes that information that it receives and passes it down through the axon, all right, to the terminals. People call them terminals. I don't call them terminals. I call them terminal buttons, terminal branches. People do call them terminal boutons, but these are the endpoint of a neuron, and this is the terminal, essentially, where the message will be relayed to an opposing neuron. Neurotransmitters, synapse, receptor site. So these are all really important. Synapse is the gap in between two neurons, so it's from the releasing neuron to the accepting neuron. So what would be the releasing neuron? That structure? Yep, that would be the terminal button, and the recepting location where the receptor sites are, and that's what the neurotransmitters fit into. So the neurotransmitters are released from the terminal buttons. Neurotransmitters are chemical, so they're released from the terminal buttons, and they are pass through the synapse, which is a gap between the two neurons, and you have the receptor site on the opposing side of a neuron, and so the receptor site is located on either the dendrite or the soma, which is the cell body, and this is the receptor site where the neurotransmitters fit into. Once the receptor site is oh my goodness, I was feeling great, and now this cold and this cough is coming back on. Excuse me. So those neurotransmitters bind to the receptor site and open a gate, which allows ions to flow in or out. I know I'm giving you mucho information here, but this is all really important. Neurotransmitters bind to the receptor site. Ions can flow in or out, and that change of those ions are positively or negatively charged particles that influx into a neuron or out of a neuron can make the neuron more likely to fire or less likely to fire. One important piece that I always tell my intro class is that the neurotransmitters, a lot of people think that they actually enter inside of the dendrite or the soma, and they don't. Okay, they only enter onto the receptor site, which then opens a gate. It really is kind of like a gate, and then ions, positively or negatively charged ions, can come in or they can leave, and that can either increase the likelihood that the cell is going to fire or decrease the likelihood of a cell that is going to fire. And now this is all really, really important information because this is how drugs work. Okay, any form of psychotropic medication and psychotropic drug, even we're talking about here, marijuana, LSD, even you start getting to like alcohol and antipsychotics, antidepressants, they work in some way where they work at the synapse, influencing the level of neurotransmitters or some sort of endogenous meaning it comes from outside of the body, such as alcohol. Alcohol is not made inside of the body, obviously. That comes from outside of the body and it comes in, and that is going to influence a receptor site. Okay, and so these drugs work in this way. So it's really important that individuals know how a neuron actually works inside of the nervous system, and hopefully this helped out just a little bit. Here's a great picture of a neuron, and so this is what we were just talking about. So you probably looked at this in your textbook. I don't need to explain it because hopefully you were looking at this earlier. And now one noteworthy thing here is that there's a lot of different types of neurons in brains. Okay, hundreds of different types. This is stereotypical type. Okay, and it's just noteworthy to say that some researchers are looking into actually different types of neurons to see how those different types, what their role is in different diseases, as well as Alzheimer's disease and even things like depression. And that would be interest to some people potentially, but for this class, just know stereotypical neuron. Again, another nice representation. What we're seeing here is a cell body, which is what I call a soma. And as you can see, the soma, there are many. These would be terminal buttons connecting to the actual neuron. So these are other neurons, so like neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3, neuron 4 coming in, neuron 5 coming in, neuron 6 coming in. And so these would be potentially all other neurons, or they're just terminal buttons from maybe one or two neurons. Okay, here's the end of a neuron. So it'd be like this guy snaking around, coming up here, boom. And as you can see inside of here, we have basically what we really just need to look at here is the synaptic vesicle, and that's how you pronounce it. And inside of the vesicle contains neurotransmitters. Okay, and these neurotransmitters are those chemicals that will bind to the, right there, the receptor site, that will then allow, gates to either open or close, and then the change in the gate structure will allow ions to either come in or out of this cell body, this guy right here, making that cell more or less likely to fire, depending on the voltage of the ions. And we don't need to get into the details of that, but it's a pretty good representation of this slide here. Excuse me for 1 second, I'm just going to make sure that everything is recording properly. Okay, everything seems to be fine. So hopefully you guys know some of the neurotransmitters. There's many neurotransmitters, but here's a few of them. Some of these will be important later on. Say this one right here, acetylcholine. As you can say it, acetylcholine, many different ways. Dopamine, another one. Norepinephrine, as well as serotonin. You probably all have heard of these. You can obviously read the functions and the potential abnormalities associated with them. Actually, I was going to say many of these, so you can just feel free to read it on your own. We will talk about these in depth later on, especially dopamine, serotonin, a little bit norepinephrine, acetylcholine, especially in respect to Alzheimer's disease, the tragic disorder oftentimes experienced by elderly people, but almost any age range could acquire it as long as they're over like 30 to 40 years of age, but very rare for earlier. This is a terrible graph. It's so small. I'm sorry about this. But this is a great point to look at in that we're not looking at the neurons so much anymore. So the neurons are tiny. They are extremely small. Now what we're looking at here is what sorts of cells make up the nervous system. And so you've probably all heard of the nervous system before. And so if we're thinking about the neurons are involved with all of these, okay? But the neurons for, say, like the structure of the brain that we always think of, where we think and experience things, that would obviously be the central nervous system. So in the nervous system, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Nobody ever breaks it down into the spinal and the brain. They're just part of the central nervous system. So this is almost a good way to show you what not to do. The spinal column and the brain are made up of they are the part of the central nervous system. So most people never have this breakdown here. The spinal cord and the brain, okay? They're just part of it, so you don't need to put this here, okay? Now, the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, this is important to remember. You guys hopefully did this in Intro to Psych. I hammer my students with this. But you have two separate offshoots from here. You have the first one have called the autonomic nervous system, as well as the somatic nervous system. These two nervous systems, respectively, deal with things that are automatic within the body, meaning like glands, smooth muscle tissue, as well as the organs, some organs, okay, not all, but some organs, okay. And then the somatic is a nervous system that deals with the body, essentially proper, meaning that this is basically the muscles of the body. And so autonomic is you don't have control over this, okay? And the somatic is you actually do have control over this. And that makes sense because the somatic, you can move your muscles controllingly. You can move your arms, you can move your legs, the particular muscles of those actual structures. Whereas the autonomic, say like the endocrine system with your glands, the smooth muscles within your body of, say, your diaphragm. I mean, you can do this, but there's also a way that it does this automatically. Same goes for your heart. You don't really necessarily need to control. Well, you cannot really control how quickly your heart rate is, how fast your heart is beating. And so this is the autonomic in that it's automatic. And you have two breakdowns from the autonomic. Somatic, you have none. Autonomic is the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic. All right, these two people need to know. They're very, very easy to think about. There's a term that goes with these. Maybe you know these, maybe you don't. One is called the fight and flight, and the other is called the rest and digest. So think about this for a moment and think about which goes with which. My luck is it says it right there on that small slide. No, not necessarily completely. But the fight and flight, guys, is this one, sympathetic. Rest and digest is the parasympathetic. Meaning that when you are in a state of rawr, when you're in a state where you get scared, it's likely you're going to have sympathetic nervous system arousal. Meaning you're going to be ready to either fight an organism, a threat, or you're going to be able to run away from that threat. The parasympathetic nervous system starts coming online once you evade or you defeat that organism, and therefore then you can start resting and digesting your food. Okay, I don't need to get into too many details. Hopefully you've gone over these things in the past. One super easy way to remember this is I like to think about these things as like, what does the word actually sound like? So students have often said to me, I think about it a different way, but students have said to me, and I think this way actually works better than how I think about it, is just think about like what para sounds like. Pear, it sounds like a pear, like pear. We're not talking about like an au pair. I think that's how you pronounce it, like a person who comes from a different country who comes in and, watches your kids, and it's like a paid nanny from like Denmark or Russia or Poland or something like that, au pair. We're talking just pear, like the things that you eat. So a pear is rest and digest, and that's a pear, you eat it, and so therefore you're going to be resting and digest while you're eating it. Easy way to associate parasympathetic with rest and digest. Okay, so here's some brain structures. Guys, you can just look at these are really easy. Let me just try to keep going until we get to a spot where it's really important for abnormal psychology. Okay, so now we're starting to go to some areas of the limbic system. Let me just focus on that really quickly. This is a structure that includes the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the thalamus, as well as the hippocampus. Researchers believe that this deals with memory in particular, as well as emotions such as aggression. It also deals with the drives of an individual, thirst, hunger, so on and so forth. And this is an important structure. The limbic system, it's composed of those four separate, entities within the brain. And this might be important later on, so keep the limbic system in the back of your mind, especially for, say, memory, the hippocampus, but as well as the experiencing fear and emotion for some other sorts of disorders. Basal ganglia is even one involved, but a little bit in Parkinson's disease. All right. Okay, so just some very easy things in respect to actually where these structures are located. For the test, there is a little bit of information that assesses your knowledge of where these structures are located, but I know that most people, probably don't remember their intro to psych too perfectly, and you may have never even taken a brain and behavior class or a biology class, and so I don't expect you to know all of these things. Okay, but some structures are towards the depths of the brain. Okay, some of those would be the limbic system, the basal ganglia. All right, but then you have some of these other areas like the motor area and the sensory area. Okay, these areas are more towards the outer portion of the brain. They actually are on the outer portion of the brain. And the motor and the sensory, if you remember from intro to psych, the motor deals with specific movements your body is making, as the sensory is your body is receiving input. That would be your skin, your epidermis, is actually experiencing input from the environment, and you're experiencing it within your brain, such as tactile. So this would be pressure. This would also be cold, temperature, cold and warm, as well as pain, and so that's located in the sensory area. Again, if you don't know and you don't remember the function of some of these different areas within the brain, you can always review back here. Very simple to remember. It's always good to have an idea of what these areas within the brain do. The frontal, the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. And that is because many of these disorders, say depression, schizophrenia, even things like bipolar disorder, are oftentimes, and especially ADHD, I just keep adding on here, but these are oftentimes, some sort of issue has been found to be involved with the function of this cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. Okay, so just exactly what I said earlier in respect to the PNS. Okay, so everyone is probably quite familiar with nature versus nurture. Okay, so nature, that would be genes, versus nurture is how you're raised. Okay, and so there's an interesting debate between researchers of whether it's nature or nurture, and most researchers now believe that it's and they believe this for many years, but that it's a conglomeration, a combination of nature and nurture. Okay, you probably do too. Like, you're not just how you are born, but it's also how you're raised, and that's what makes you who you are. Okay, that's great. However, there's this additional layer that seems to complicate things. It doesn't necessarily complicate things, but it makes it more interesting. And this is called epigenetics. The textbook will cover this a little bit, but not as much as, say, a textbook in, say, 10 to 20 years. And so epigenetics is basically, how I'd like to describe this really quickly, is that you have the DNA. All right, just imagine, like, close your eyes right now, okay? Imagine that you're looking at the DNA, okay? The DNA is wrapped around. It's almost like a ladder that is spun around upon itself with rungs in this ladder that you could climb up, okay? And so you're looking at a portion, you're standing on a portion, and you keep climbing, and there's particular areas on this DNA. They're called genes, and this is a small grouping of the DNA where that gene codes for some sort of, it could code specifically for something, like it could code for, your eye color. It could code for your hair color if you have an extra digit on your finger, yada yada yada. Sometimes these genes, combine with other genes to, again, code for things like, say, personality, okay? So again, there's genes within our DNA that code for some things, okay? Sometimes they have to combine with others to help, express this gene, but essentially you have genes, okay? And genes allow for your body to be what it is. And so what this epigenetics is this outer layer around the actual DNA that will actually help silence, mean it will turn off a gene, or it could express a gene, meaning that the gene was not expressed, it was silent in the beginning, but now this epigenome, this above the gene, above the DNA, is actually expressing the gene, making that gene allowed to express, say, you didn't have the risk for cancer because the gene was silenced, and now, boom, this epigenetic change comes in, and now the DNA is now expressed, that gene is expressed, and now you may potentially have the risk for cancer. And so this is really interesting. That's a pretty low-level explanation of what's going on here with epigenetics. But to hammer this home, researchers believe this is a huge thing in respect to stress. So mothers who are experiencing stress while they are having, they're a mother in the sense that they're carrying a child in their womb still. So if the child is in the embryonic or fetal stage, the latter stages, the longest stages rather of prenatal development, that's when the child is within the womb and not born yet, that if the mother is exposed to large amounts of stress, those large amounts of stress that the mother is experiencing, so they will actually change the DNA of that offspring that is developing inside of her, making that offspring more susceptible to experiencing stress for him or herself at a later point. And researchers believe what's going on here is some sort of potential change to the DNA of the unborn, the embryo or the fetus's DNA through epigenetic factors. Okay, and that's just one sliver of all of the ongoing and the plenty of research that has been conducted so far. So that is epigenetics. All right, so excuse me. So we've covered the biological approach in some pretty good depth. Let's start actually going on to the psychological perspective. Okay, so to start getting into the psychological perspective, the first one that we're going to talk about is something that's kind of far from really what researchers would consider a psychological perspective. This is psychodynamic. We've talked about this already, psychoanalysis. Guys, this is fairly easy for y'all to understand, and you've gone over this before in Intro to Psych. I've always heard that who goes over these things more, psychology or English? and it may actually be English class. English courses go over Dr. Sigmund Freud more than psychology does. Oftentimes the consciousness is represented via a iceberg analogy, and this is very similar. It gets the point across: consciousness, preconscious, unconscious. Let me just quickly say what this is. Consciousness is what you're thinking about right now. So you're thinking about my voice. Maybe, oh, what's he think? Like, is his cold getting better? Oh, maybe you weren't thinking about that. And if you weren't thinking about that, that would have been in your preconscious, because it was probably there. You probably know that I have a cold, but maybe you weren't thinking about it right then and there, but now you are. So now me having a cold and my coughing, that's in your consciousness. But what would be the unconscious, or what some people call the subconscious? Well, that would be something like you don't have any idea of, that you know, but you actually know it. So this is like, I don't know, some sort of word that I said on the first slide of the first chapter. If you listen to that, I don't even know what I said, whatever I said, it's likely Dr. Freud would say that it's in your unconscious somewhere. It could influence your behavior, and it could influence your thoughts in some way, but you just have no ability to access it whatsoever. Easy stuff to comprehend: the id, the ego, and the superego. Feel free to ask me if you have questions on this, but most people understand these factors, especially because they are gone over in other classes, and at this elementary level they also are gone over in other psychology classes. This is still just talking about the id, the ego, now the superego. Now these are important, especially into abnormal psychology, because what's happening here is, when people start, according to Dr. Freud, when people start experiencing some sort of distress, that is maybe some sort of unconscious distress or some sort of unpleasant feelings, they may have some sort of defense mechanism, and a defense mechanism is a way to basically help themselves, shield themselves from thoughts that will provoke a sense of dread, anxiety, or fear. So it's important to know what Dr. Sigmund Freud mentioned in respect to these. Didn't want to necessarily turn the slide. In respect to these defense mechanisms, okay? And so these defense mechanisms are seen as unconscious mechanisms, these unconscious processes that take place within an individual. And so there's a whole list of them. You can go over these for yourself. It would take me a long time to go over each one of these individually. But these are all defense mechanisms. Some of them you probably have noted with people doing in the past. Some you probably see other people doing right now. And these are all defense mechanisms. So let's just look at denial. If you're in a state of denial, it's basically you are refusing to understand, or to even to accept some sort of claim that is more than likely true. And so that's denial. And here's a good example. And so there's a description and examples of all of these. And so basically what Dr. Freud would do in treatment of these, let me just talk about treatment right now, is if he saw, or if any sort of psychoanalyst or psychodynamic therapist saw an individual, or heard rather of an individual displaying one of these defense mechanisms, that they would try to point these out and basically try to show an individual that they are actually going through some sort of unconscious process to try to keep their underlying fear or anxiety hidden. The stages of psychosexual development are important, and you can read about these on your own. Now, this is, again, interesting so much that it is just interesting. There's not a lot of research that really has gone into, that has supported, rather, either the Oedipus or the Electra complex, even fixations in respect to an individual. And so they're interesting to think about, but the actual support for these is rather minimal, if non-existent. Okay, so we're getting at a point where we're actually starting to segue past Dr. Sigmund Freud and get into Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson's an important individual who basically wanted, and not necessarily wanted, but basically believed that people are trying to shoot for to be the best that they could possibly be. Okay, so I know this is kind of herky-jerky here, and it will start to simmer down a little bit. But if you're thinking about another word that you may want to just put into the back of your mind, psychosis. Oftentimes people think that psychosis is only dedicated to schizophrenia, where it's actually not. Okay, this is basically someone is having a difficulty with understanding what's real from what's fake. Okay, what's real from what's fantasy. And so basically a person who's in a state of psychosis is no longer attached to the here and now. All right, their thoughts, their behaviors are oftentimes disturbed, and it makes it difficult to interpret what is going on a daily basis. So psychosis can actually come into play in very deep and traumatic forms of depression, bipolar disorder, and obviously schizophrenia, amongst others. So within the psychological perspective, you also have a learning model, and this learning model you've hopefully gone over many other times. And the learning model basically suggests that people have a response to stimuli that has been learned. So if you dislike the zoo, or rather, if you are afraid of the zoo, the reason that you may be afraid of the zoo is that you were at a zoo when you were a kid, and one of your friends actually was at the zoo, and they got, I don't know, like attacked by a bear. So they got attacked by a bear at a zoo, and that's what you associate with a zoo now. So you're associating that unpleasant experience with a zoo, and now you have that fear from a zoo now, and so the zoo will equal fear. So it's some sort of learned response. Behaviorism, Pavlov, Watson, these are all important people. You should know them. Obviously, B.F. Skinner, so all these professors know them, know who they are, know what they do. Pavlov, Watson, they kind of group together in respect to classical conditioning, whereas B.F. Skinner is more operant conditioning. That is, that you do a behavior for a consequence. Should be obviously Pavlov's one of Pavlov's Dalmatians. I don't believe he used Dalmatians, although that looks like the dog. That doesn't really look like a Dalmatian, but maybe it's just got like dirt on him or something. But nonetheless, this would be apparatus that basically exactly how Pavlov measured his original experiments. Guys, not even going to go over this. I have some wonderful slides on my YouTube channel, The Psychology Professor, that covers these in details. So if you want to learn more about them and you don't get it from here, go there. Yep, again, go there. Mine's clearer than this, but gets the same point across. Oh, this is fairly clear, actually. Operant conditioning, as I was just saying earlier. Operant conditioning involves two things: reinforcement and punishment, as well as positive and negative. You need to know what they are. Positive, negative means positive means adding, negative means subtracting. Reinforcement means to increase behavior, punishment means to decrease behavior. These are all important to know because there will be forms of therapy that relate to these later on. So say something along the lines of token economies. Token economies are actually really effective at helping individuals get past, well, not get past, but helping to treat things like schizophrenia, even people who have autism. They fall on the autism spectrum disorder, and they get reinforcement for doing good deeds, and so that's a token economy, and that relates directly to operant conditioning. All right, Albert Bandura put into notion the social cognitive approach, and basically, for the most part, sorry about that, But this basically involves outsiders, okay, so that you actually see people, do some sort of behavior, and then you're more likely to do that behavior. Humanistic approach is, again, somewhat similar to, it's not very similar to behaviorism. It's more actually similar to the psychodynamic approach or the psychoanalytic approach, where there is an emphasis on the unconscious. However, an individual, again, like I was kind of saying earlier with Erik Erikson, they try to reach their most highest potential. So this would be another individual that goes with this, like Carl Rogers, as well as Abraham Maslow. You've probably heard of both of those individuals. And in this, one should give unconditional positive regard, okay, when you're doing this sort of treatment. An unconditional positive regard, that is different than conditional positive regard. And so you've probably heard from, your parents, or I think there's that song that goes, well, I don't even want to sing it because it'll sound terrible. And I don't even really know how it goes. It's awkward. But it's unconditional, like unconditional love. And so to love someone unconditionally, that means you're not tying any strings to your love. It's like whatever that person does, you'll love them regardless. So basically, unconditional positive regard is the same exact thing. And this is an important theme to treating a person, where basically, if a person is experiencing some sort of psychological disorder, like, say, depression, they feel that oftentimes whatever they do is bad. They feel that whatever people think about them is bad. And so if you have a conditional positive regard, that means you only value them for the good that they do. That's almost like reinforcing their depression. And if you have an unconditional positive regard, meaning that you value them and you show them that they're worthy no matter what they do, even when they fail, then that is almost it's almost going against their depression, saying that they are a good person for whatever they do, and you'll love them regardless. You'll think of them as having high worth regardless. And so therefore, what researchers believe is that this could start to stamp out depression as well as some other cognitive ailments. Okay, so now we're starting to move towards a cognitive model, and I'm going to take a quick break here. Pause it. Okay, I'm back. Got a cough drop. I'm hoping this helps a little bit. Anybody ever had Fisherman's Friends? Wait, Fisherman's Friend? Those are really good. However, why I'm saying this is I couldn't find those, and those are typically my go-to cough drop. I don't really need them too much, but when I do have, like that tickle in the back of my throat, those things help considerably. But I think my daughter stole mine, and so I had to go with some Halls. They're citrus, so that's good because I really like the sweet flavor of like grapefruit and oranges. So I think this will be good. I hope. Okay. So the cognitive is basically you're placing emphasis on your thoughts, okay, thought process of an individual. And so of individuals who are depressed, and I keep going to depression because it's a very stereotypical way to conceptualize depression in respect to a cognitive, I always call it a cognitive etiology. You can Google it, make sure you're spelling it right, etiology. But an etiology is a cause, and so a cognitive etiology of depression, so that'd be the cause of depression would be a cognitive approach, and this is oftentimes claimed to be a part of it, depression, that a person who's depressed oftentimes has these distortions with thinking, okay? So with thinking, their expectations, their beliefs, their attitudes, are different from a person who's not depressed, or when they're not depressed, it's different than when they are depressed. Let me just give you an example really quickly. So I like to think about Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, and so if you look at Eeyore and his behaviors that he does, he's walking down and he's like, I was walking down the creek the other day and I saw Pooh, and Pooh, he didn't say hi to me. Pooh must hate me, just like everyone else. Maybe say something like that. And so that would obviously be a distortion in thinking, in that, Winnie the Pooh could have been doing anything. But Eeyore is just jumping to the conclusion that Winnie the Pooh doesn't say hi to him, he hates him, and then he's jumping to the other conclusion that everyone hates him. So these are some distortions in thinking, and possibly the attitudes that Eeyore has. And so a classic case of cognitive approach to explaining the various disorders, especially in respect to depression. Now, oftentimes, when a person develops, say, as it says right there, schizophrenia, there is a dramatic change, and this is, I kind of say this with a hint of like a caveat, like sometimes there is a major change in the way that they think, and sometimes there is not a major change in the way that they think. What I mean here is the information processing, and so this involves attention, this involves problem solving, this includes short-term / working memory, long-term memory. This can even include communication, okay, as well as recognition, and so that goes into the sensory and perceptual processes as well. And so overall, this is a large approach to the information processing, and basically with some disorders, especially like schizophrenia, it can influence an individual's way that they see the world dramatically, okay? And so this is another form of a psychological approach to how disorders begin, what disorders actually are. So here's two researchers, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. Okay. Both of them cognitive in nature for the most part. Albert Ellis basically tried to treat individuals and basically described behaviors based on the ABC approach. The A is the antecedent, the activating event, so the event that's actually causing it, the antecedent, like I was saying. The B is the individual's beliefs. So you have the antecedent mixing in with the individual's actual beliefs, and that's going to produce a C, a consequence. All right, and so the ABC approach is a very nice way to go about thinking about why is someone doing something. Well, it's the thing that actually came first. Like, say someone yelled at you, you have a belief that people are mean. Therefore, when someone yells, you automatically think that they're being mean, and therefore the consequence would be some sort of you acting out, maybe you getting very, as it even says right there, very distraught. So that is Albert Ellis. Now, Aaron Beck, though, he is one who put forward many of these very specific cognitive distortions that an individual has. And so for Aaron Beck, cognitive distortions, like I just said right there, cognitive distortions is what Eeyore was basically doing. And so you can look at the selective abstraction 2 and 3 and 4, and you can look at those within your textbook. But these are cognitive distortions. So if you think about this, guys, if a person has a cognitive distortion, and they are, they seem like they're depressed, what would you do? If they are thinking that everyone, once they do bad on one test, they say, "Oh, I'm never going to do well on any other tests," or they get 5 tests back and 4 of them are great, but one of them is not great, and they say, "Oh, that's it. I didn't do good on any of the tests," right? It's all or nothing. Like I have to be all great or it's nothing. And so what would you do? Well, what Aaron Beck would do is he would try to point out where these fallacies exist, saying, "Hey, you just did good on 4 tests, my man. it's just one that you didn't do well on. So let's think about what are the ramifications behind here. You actually are a good student overall. You just didn't do well on one. And so trying to point these out to people might be a way to help actually improve an individual's depression. All right, moving past the psychological, moving towards the society and cultural, we'll actually start to talk about this a little bit more. And so this places a large emphasis on nature. Nurture rather, the environment that an individual lives in. Some of these I'm just gonna kind of whiz through. Let me just hit the escape button really quickly here. Good. So we're moving at a pretty nice clip. So it's just noteworthy that there are differences between various races in respect to what an individual is actually experiencing disorder-wise. And actually, some of the interesting research comes from looking at people who grow up in another country, and so this is outside of this. I'm talking outside of this one here. Sorry, individuals who grow up in, say, Asia. Okay, there's lower rates of depression over in Asia. However, when they come to the United States of America, there seems to be an increase in depression for those individuals coming from Asia. And so, is America causing the depression? Well, researchers don't think so. Researchers actually believe that this change in culture is not actually, like a major shock. While it can be a shock, what's actually going on here is now that they come to the United States of America, they are more likely to talk about and seek treatment for the issues that they were in fact having over in Asia, and that they're still continuing to have now. All right, so these are important things to consider, but you can look in these for yourself. Two things really don't talk about too much. Already talked about it before. Biopsychosocial approach. Biopsychosocial. Okay, great point to bring up right here. The Diathesis-Stress Model. The Diathesis-Stress Model, what that's basically saying is the diathesis is an individual has a genetic predisposition to a disorder. Okay? Stress, it actually almost should be like diathesis-stressor model, because stress is what a person feels. Stressors are things in the environment. And so basically what this is saying, the diathesis-stressor, the stress model, is basically saying that when you have almost a perfect storm here for an individual to develop a psychological disorder. For one, if an individual already has that diathesis, meaning that they have the predisposition to a disorder, and now it's coupled with an enlarged amount of stressors, that would be environmental exposure to, say, natural disasters, death of a loved one, sexual assault, loss of a job, yada yada yada, bullying even. These would be things that would be stressors, and so basically it's like a combination of the predisposition plus the stress actually increases the prevalence of a psychological disorder, or increases the rate at which an individual will develop such a disorder. And that's the Diathesis-Stress Model. There you have it exactly, just as I was saying a moment ago. Okay, just to review, a nice little figure showing us, rather it's a table showing us the differences between the different large type of perspectives, with the specific types of models located within here, their focus, and the key questions that they look for. Now, what we just went over, we went over the perspectives, and now those perspectives, depending on which one a researcher aligns themselves with, meaning that if they believe more strongly in the biological approach, well, they're likely going to use some sort of drugs or some sort of therapy that's going to influence the function of the brain. If a person believes very, very strongly in a behavioral line of developing a disorder, then they're going to use behavioral type therapies that are going to try to change the way a person acts and associates stimuli together. And so again, these prior perspectives are really, really important for researchers in how they will treat an individual. Oh my gosh, and I'm so sorry that with my voice. I need to record these in the morning. I feel great in the morning, but now it's really late. It's like 1 o'clock, and you guys probably know what I'm talking about. You know, you get late. You know, oftentimes, actually, on a side note, oftentimes later at night is when people start, their psychological disorders start coming out the most, and it's actually really interesting that also sometimes pain starts to increase for individuals, chronic pain, sometimes vision problems start to, rear their ugly head more so, and even colds sometimes get worse too as night goes on. And I know I'm totally digressing here, but there's probably some interesting correlations that individuals have looked at in the past here. But let's go on. Okay. Some important pieces to note. Okay, there's so many different types of people that you could actually go see to be treated if you have a psychological disorder. So, psychiatrist and clinical psychologist. What's the difference? Well, there's a big difference. Okay, psychiatrist, they have their degree in medication. Okay, medicine. Okay, and so that allows them the ability to prescribe drugs. So, therefore, you automatically infer, oh, clinical psychologists, they can prescribe drugs. And yes, overall, to a level, you would be correct. However, within Illinois and some other states, as well as some other states within the United States of America, an individual who's a clinical psychologist, if they go through a particular amount of schooling, additional to their PhD, I believe it's PhD in PsyD, that they have the ability to then receive a certificate with a little bit more education and some practicum hours, where they could actually be able to prescribe medication to individuals who are seeking medication for various psychological disorders. Now you can think about that as good as bad. It's people who are not a doctor in the medical sense being able to prescribe medication, and that could be dangerous. However, the good thing is this medication is oftentimes pretty safe, and there is a big need, especially in Illinois, for more psychiatrists to prescribe medication to individuals, and so hopefully that ability of some clinical psychologists could basically start to thin the gap. Just other types of individuals who are going to be health professionals who will try to, help diagnose and treat an individual. So psychotherapy is an important term to wrap your head around early and often. So psychotherapy is the overarching key term here, and psychotherapy is basically a way of looking at the talking as some sort of manner, some verbal interaction, as it says right there, to treat an individual. Okay, and this is oftentimes comes between a client and a clinician, or the client and the therapist. And so there's many different forms of psychotherapy, and we're going to try to talk about some of those right now. Okay, so first type is psychoanalysis as well as psychodynamic. Okay, again, psychoanalysis by Dr. Freud, large emphasis placed on the unconscious, Psychodynamic is what's basically put forward today. It's a quicker type of therapy, less involved with sex overall. Okay, so let me clarify. What I mean by that is there's less of an emphasis placed on sexual urges, okay? But there still is an emphasis, all right? What psychoanalysis or a psychodynamic therapist would use is two methods. Free association, it's really simple to understand. It's basically thinking about whatever, I believe I talked about this in the first chapter. The first chapter is PowerPoint. Basically, free association is an individual is basically saying the first thing that comes to their mind. And this is a way that Dr. Sigmund Freud and others believe gets at the unconscious. Another way is, as it says there, dream analysis. Okay? Dream analysis is in respect to you analyze an individual's dreams. You ask a person, hey, tell me what you're dreaming about. Why do you do that? If you're a psychoanalyst or a psychodynamic therapist, why would you do this? Well, you're trying to get at the unconscious. And one way to get at the unconscious is through analyzing the dreams. Because when a person's dreaming, they're unconscious. And you have two different forms. You have the manifest content of a dream. That is the actual material of the dream. And you have the latent content. That's like the laid down, hidden, underlying reason behind a dream. And so that's really what the researchers, or rather the therapists, are going for, is they're trying to figure out the latent content of any dream. So whatever you dream, but basically it's like, what are you really dreaming about? I know that you're running from a bear, and that would be the manifest content, running from a bear. But what does that really mean? Maybe you're running away from a bully at school, and you're kind of afraid of a bully, and every time this bully comes around, you kind of back down. And he might not even be bullying you, but he's bullying other people, and you're just afraid that he might bully you or she might bully you. So that would be this latent content, is like, this hidden, it relates to something in your real life. You can look at transference and countertransference. These are things that psychoanalysis would also believe in. All right, so here's some that we were talking about earlier a little bit. The behavioral therapy. Excuse me one more time. Now let's pretend you have a phobia, all right? You're afraid of, I'll say this, and you probably are like, whoa, how did he know I was afraid of that, man? Well, you're probably afraid of snakes, or spiders, or like, I don't know if they're millipedes, but we get them in like our garage a lot, in our basement sometimes. Those bugs that are not really thin, but they're kind of wide. They have maybe, I don't know, like 50 or 100. I don't know if they have 100 legs. I just think that they do. They're long legs, big antenna. They move really quickly. They're like 2 inches long. Maybe you're afraid of those things. Maybe you're afraid of heights. Who knows what you're afraid of? But basically, if you're afraid of those things, you're probably gonna stay away from those things, right? And so if you stay away from those things, you're never really exposed to those things to realize that they really don't cause any problems to you. And so therefore staying away from them will never expose you to them, and exposure to these things could actually help you, because you'll start to realize, oh, they're not going to harm me. And so these types of therapies, some of these behavioral therapies, try to expose you to the actual fear-provoking stimuli, such as systematic desensitization. You can read it in the textbook, really easy to understand, and that is a gradual exposure. So this gradual exposure goes with systematic desensitization. Also have, just like I was saying earlier, token economy. Don't need to say it again because I was just saying this. Modeling is kind of goes off of with Albert Bandura in respect to, you show behaviors and you have other individuals, your client, model these behaviors after you're doing it. So they're imitating you. Like I was saying earlier, even too, with Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers believed in what's known as client-centered therapy. So This is where the client is basically the show. They're running things. You're trying to guide them through, and you're trying to have them live to their reach their fullest capacity by giving them a state of unconditional positive regard. And again, you should remember what that is. Excuse me. Just going to bypass, very easy to understand. As I was saying earlier, unconditional positive regard. Empathy in these Carl Rogers person-centered therapy is very important. So basically, hey guys, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? Like sympathy is you could feel bad for someone, you could feel, fearful for someone, but empathy is more, a lot of people say it's more higher level in respect to that. You don't just feel sad for someone, you actually feel what the person's going through. So I oftentimes think about this for, the animal ethics. I mean, you can feel sad for a dog who's going through a some sort of medical procedure in the name of curing cancer or something. You can feel bad for them, but if you have empathy for them, it's like you really feel what they could feel, and you could see potentially how bad it really is and what they're actually experiencing, and almost like you can walk in their shoes. And that is a little bit deeper sense than just sympathy. And so these are all important things for person-centered therapy, because you want to come off as though you're a legitimate friend, a legitimate source of abilities for the client to confide in and be able to open up and talk to you. So there has to be a level of empathy, genuineness, as well as congruence in respect to what you say, what you think. These need to be in line. Great, this is what I was talking about earlier, cognitive therapy in respect to Beck and Alice, and trying to point out where their cognitive distortions might be. And this is where this REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, kind of comes into play, where you try to change the way that an individual behaves, because this is a response to some sort of stimulus that they're having, and if you replace this response, this almost automatic response, to this antecedent, you will help this individual go through their daily struggles by replacing this maladaptive response. Say something along the lines of their thoughts, or even a response that they get mad at someone, and this will essentially assist them with their psychological disorders. Again, as I was saying earlier, here's just a combination of the cognitive behavioral therapy, both trying to change their thoughts and their behaviors. Again, you guys can read about this. I know I've been talking for a long period of time, so I'm just going to skim through this. Again, nice table explaining everything. That's a lot of information. Let's go. Nice way to show in a figure all the different types of therapies that are out there, and the percentage that actually use and believe in each of these therapies. And so what you have is you have a nice breakdown between many of these. Humanistic is really not that popular anymore. Psychodynamic is still fairly popular, but not as popular as, say, cognitive. Behavioral is somewhat popular. And this eclective is basically a combination of multiple types of different routes of therapy. This is actually a good point in time of saying, hey, what do you actually think? Which one is the most effective therapy? Well, and researchers have looked at this, and basically what researchers have found is that one type of therapy really isn't better than other types of therapy. it really seems to be that almost any of them have about the same effectiveness. Some are more, adept at treating some disorders, like say cognitive, fairly good at treating depression. Behavioral, fairly good at treating anxiety disorders. And some of the others are, they have, kind of a mix. But beyond that, it's, the person who's going in, what they feel is going to work, they seek this out, and if they think that cognitive will work, well, it's more likely to work. If that person thinks that cognitive is going to work and then they have to go to a behavioral, then that might not work so much. But so it's the combination of potentially who the person is and who they're seeking out, and whoever these people do seek out, though, it does seem to help them, depending almost no matter what. Where you compare cognitive versus behavioral versus psychodynamic, they all work about pretty similar, which is really interesting. You don't always have to get therapy by yourself. You can get it with other individuals. That cough drop actually did seem to help just a little bit. All right, it's okay. One thing that I do like to talk about in many of my other classes is a nice psychological a term for science sake, and this is called a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is a pretty fancy way of going about collecting data from other studies that have already collected the data. So a meta-analysis, basically, that is grouping together a lot of research findings that researchers have already published, taking all that information together, running statistics, running analyses on that data, and taking all the data not just from one study or two studies or three studies that involve a couple hundred people, but mainly every study that has been conducted in a particular realm. And as you can see here from Smith and Glass in 1977, they took basically 375 various experiments that had likely tens to hundreds of participants in them, thousands probably potentially overall in this 375 study experiment study. And basically what they found is that most people do seem to get better. They do seem to get better, as it says exactly down there, which is perfect. So they get better in psychotherapy than if they weren't in psychotherapy. So this is offering some potential information that actually psychotherapy is beneficial. But that's a meta-analysis, very strong way to make a claim, and you guys see how it's strong? Well, it's strong because it doesn't just take one or two small studies or even big studies. It takes all the studies together. So all the studies together, there's always going to be some studies that find something and then maybe some that don't. But hopefully what you should see is not like a 50-50, like 50% of the studies say, ooh, psychotherapy was effective, and 50% of the experiments say, no, psychotherapy was not effective. That would not be good. If that was like that, that would mean that psychotherapy is fairly ineffective. But what the researchers found is, when you group these together, is that actually 3/4 of the people out of all those 375 studies, they got better than those who were in the non-treatment group. And so therefore, again, meta-analysis important, as well as psychotherapy seems to have a role in society. Okay, so just some ways, again, that if you're really curious on various types of disorders that we will talk about this semester, and the various types of treatments for them. Again, many of these treatments can be used for a multitude of disorders, but here are some where empirically supported. If you go back to the other slide, what that means is that science and the scientific method has supported these strongly at reducing or improving the function. So like I said, cognitive, depression, even behavioral therapy forms with depression. Should also see anxiety disorders up here as well. Yep, right here. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Boom, right there. Okay. But nonetheless, pretty decent table showing which is very solid at treating what disorder. Alright, so these last slides, while they're very important for cross-cultural wise, they're a small niche in the whole big picture in the United States of America of abnormal psychology. And so I'm going to skip through a lot of these without saying anything, and for one reason, that's because it also is getting pretty late here as well. 12:37, not too bad. We haven't been talking too awfully long, so that's okay. And so let's just kind of go through these kind of quickly here. These are all really important if you ever see yourself as being a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, or some sort of therapist. Very, very important to know who your client is, and not just like who your client is as a person, but what culture they come from, because what culture they come from obviously can dictate what type of way that they're going to interact with you, how they're going to make eye contact with you, what they are going to deem as important to talk about, different factors such as this, okay? The relationships between their parents, relationships between their friends, and so these things are rather important. But again, this is really, really important just for those who really want to be in the field of abnormal psychology / clinical psychology and or counseling. Getting into this last little thing here in respect to specific routes of biology that can be used. So this is called the biomedical approach, and biomedical approach can use various forms. So some of these include drugs, all right? Some of these include electricity. Some of them use magnets. Some of them also use light. Okay, so these are four about the biggest ways that biomedical approach is actually used, that they actually utilize. Fifth one would be the actual removal of a structure within the brain, which we actually already talked about in the last chapter, the trepanation. And so let's just talk about some of these. First thing is in respect to drugs, psychopharmacology. Psychopharmacology, awesome term, just kind of like rolls off the tongue, and basically this is what is the drug doing at a neuronal level, like at this within the synapse, wherever it's doing its thing. What is it doing to help an individual? Okay, so this is, as I was just saying, the study that examines the effects of the therapeutic effect of psychiatric drugs, and what is this doing therapeutically? Like, is this relieving depression? Are these SSRIs relieving depression? But what this doesn't say is, how are they relieving depression? What do they do in the synapse that actually allows for the depression to start to wane? Okay, so that's psychopharmacology. An important one, very important, because these are going to be some specific types of therapies that will pop up at various chapters in the future. So there's many different forms of psychiatric drugs, and these would be anti-anxiety drugs, also known as anxiolytics. They remove anxiety. But one thing to note right now before we go into details, which will be in later chapters, is these are not used over a long term, okay? Anxiolytics are primarily used if they are being used to treat anxiety disorders. They're used for a short term, okay? And that's the reason why here is because these drugs are actually pretty dangerous. You can build up a tolerance to them, and therefore you'll need more and more of it, and therefore an individual could potentially run the risk of overdosing on these and depressing the nervous system activity to a point where an individual could start to black out, pass out, maybe even go into a coma. That's the extreme, the far end of the extreme. But basically these drugs make you drowsy, just in general. And so this makes, learning, acting, driving, working very, very difficult. So they're not used over a long term. The anxiolytics are not. The antipsychotics, that goes for primarily two things. Big thing is for schizophrenia, but they're also used for other things like sedation. So there's some forms of antipsychotics that are used to help people go to sleep. All right, but primarily they're used for the improvement of schizophrenia. Antidepressants, there's a host of different types of antidepressants, many of them old, many of them new, many of them are still changing, and obviously antidepressants is some sort of drug that is going to try to make the person feel better overall. All right. Last one here is lithium. Lithium is a drug that is primarily, as it says right there, used to treat individuals who have bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder is where an individual changes from the manic state to the depressed state, and lithium is a drug that basically tries to blunt the overall experience of the manic and the depressed phase. So it tries to bring the manic phase down a little bit, and it tries to bring the depressed phase up a little bit, so that person doesn't feel as outrageously happy when they're in the manic phase, and then they don't feel as deeply depressed when they're in the depressed phase. So those are just a few really quick representations of things that you'll talk about later this semester, and a little bit more so even just right now. It's always good to have more information on this early, as this will be talked about a little bit later on too, especially when we get into the anxiety disorders. You can just read this for yourself, very easy to understand. One thing to point out here is that these antipsychotic drugs, many of the earlier ones, they're also called neuroleptics, but these earlier ones, the earlier ones are called typical. The newer variety are called atypical. So these typical, the classical, but I'll refer to them as typical. The typical antipsychotic has a lot of side effects associated to it. Some of these involve things like tremors, which is similar to things that people have when they have Parkinson's disease, so a resting tremor, where an individual shakes slightly while they are not moving. Sometimes it's hard to initiate movement, as well as muscle rigidity. Basically, individuals who take these drugs for a long period of time oftentimes will develop some of these side effects as they continue taking these medications, especially the typical antipsychotics, where they'll develop what's known as tardive dyskinesia. Yep, feel free to Google it. I'm not even going to try to spell it. Tardive dyskinesia, and that is a muscle issue in respect to the face, primarily like the lips and the jaw region, where a person will start to move their jaw almost uncontrollably. Sometimes it'll be like a locked jaw, a grinding motion that an individual will have, and these are potential side effects that can and often do happen, especially with the more classic antipsychotics. So now here, guys, we're going towards what I was talking about earlier in respect to electricity can also be used. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. There's a lot of information in respect to ECT. We could probably have an entire chapter on this information. Let me just say a couple quick things that maybe the textbook doesn't talk about. It's said to be very, very effective at relieving depression from individuals who are treatment resistant. Let me say that again. It has been said to be very, very effective at removing depression and helping individuals who are suffering from treatment-resistant depression. Meaning these people are treatment-resistant in that nothing has worked for these individuals so far. They've tried medication. They've tried different forms of psychotherapy. They've tried potentially other forms, light therapy, maybe even removal of sleep. Okay. Actually, removal of sleep has actually been found to be pretty effective at helping individuals with depression. And so these people, nothing is working for, and so they may actually resort to having their temporal lobes shocked with a small current of electricity to help an individual from their depression. Oftentimes, these people are suicidal. Or that's just nothing has helped, so that they're going for some sort of fairly extreme sort of therapy. Now, one quick thing is, most people are like, hey, how does this work? Well, researchers don't know how this works. Okay, there's many hypotheses that have been posed onto why ECT is helpful in some way to people who have depression primarily, but researchers don't know exactly why and what this ECT is actually doing to the brain itself that actually helps individuals. One more counterpoint that I'd like to add here is that, well, this does seem to help people. It is also highly, highly debated in some realms of psychology that this is actually an extremely dangerous form of therapy, and that it should actually be straight up outlawed and banned. Why is that? Well, there's some pretty bad side effects that go with ECT. One of them is memory loss, and the memory loss is rather short, meaning that the individual will not have ability to remember some things prior to the actual electroconvulsive therapy, as well as storing new information. May be actually problematic for a small short period of time after the actual procedure. So a few days after the procedure, they may not remember everything so clearly that they would have once if they did not have that ECT. But the effects will go away, and their memory will basically stabilize in the future. One other thing that is a major side effect is potential death. And so researchers have noted that because an individual is going through a very large seizure, the brain is going through a seizure, the individual is also being knocked out from general anesthetic, that these pose a risk to people, and that they shouldn't, participants, or rather clients, should not be put into the place of such sort of potential dangers where death can actually ensue. And so those are some important things with ECT, amongst many others. Already said this. Alright, so let me just go back. Let's just go back here. There's other routes. I believe I have some videos that talk about deep brain stimulation. Have some that talk about RTMS, repeated transcranial magnetic stimulation. Those are all very, very important newer varieties. Am I forgetting any? I'm forgetting any. Light therapy. Light therapy is another somewhat effective, highly controversial. Not controversial in the way that it's dangerous, but what does it do? How does it work? Is it effective? How much is it effective by, even if it is effective? And light therapy is a very common way to treat depression that is brought on by the seasons. So you get sad in the winter time. You get wad in the winter. You get sad in the winter, and therefore the reason potentially is that you don't experience enough light. So therefore, if you're put in front of a apparatus that provides light to you, that it'll help regain your vitamin D levels within your body, and that would actually potentially assist with the readily availability of specific neurotransmitters, and so that'll stabilize your mood. Bring up your mood a little bit. And there is research for this, obviously, quite considerable amount. And then, like I was saying, there's things like psychotherapy. Or psychotherapy, there is psychotherapy, but also psychosurgery, as you can see on this slide right here. So that's basically getting to the extent of it. Again, some of these procedures are more dangerous than others. So, like psychosurgery, one of the more dangerous ones. you remove a brain structure. So say for obsessive compulsive disorder, a person can't stop checking, counting, washing, things along those lines. Researchers have noted that if you remove the anterior cingulate cortex in individuals, that oftentimes these individuals who have not responded to medication, psychotherapy, actually respond somewhat well to the removal of a structure within their brain. That goes for other disorders like depression, Parkinson's disease. I know Parkinson's disease isn't a classic, or not even a non-classic psychological disorder, but there is research that suggests that these forms of therapy are actually quite effective, especially the removal of the brain structure. Okay. Well, guys, this is getting towards the end, and I'm glad I predicted it because as you can see, I'm getting quite tired. You guys are probably getting quite tired too. Hopefully this was helpful in a way of explaining the various perspectives of how a disorder begins and what are the underlying mechanisms that's making a disorder rear its ugly head, and therefore, depending on which way the perspective is sane, and which perspective you actually believe with and align yourself with, well, that's going to help determine your form of therapy. Okay, and so hopefully this was helpful. Again, maybe this is a little bit too long, maybe it's a little bit too short, maybe I ramble a little bit too much, maybe I don't. But thanks for tuning in, and good luck with this chapter. Thanks. Have a great night.